Okay, I can confirm we're live. You're good to go. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Caitlin. Go ahead and call to order the December 2020 meeting of the Alexandria Transit Company Board of Directors. It's good to have everybody here again. We will go ahead and start public comment shortly. If anyone has not indicated their interest in making public comment and would like to do so, please use the chat function so staff can record that. And while we wait for that, Josh is going to give us a briefing on some updates regarding just kind of protocols and best practices for boards and commissions meeting remotely during the pandemic. I want to thank Larry had separately sent me these guidelines, and I want to thank him for that. And this is just to make sure that we all know what we need to do. And I see I'm actually supposed to read, and actually the first thing I'm supposed to do is read this notice that has appeared on the screen. So I'll go ahead and do that and then turn this over to Josh. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic emergency, the December 9th, 2020 meeting of the Alexandria Transit Company Board of Directors is being held electronically pursuant to Virginia Code Section 2.2-3708.2A3, the Continuity of Government Ordinance, adopted by City Council on June 20th, 2020, or Section 4-0.01G and HB29, HB30, enacted by the 2020 Virginia General Assembly, Virginia Acts of Assembly, Chapters 1283 and 1289 to undertake essential business. All the members of the board and staff are participating from remote locations through a Zoom meeting. This meeting is being held electronically unless a determination is made that it is safe enough to be held in person at the Alexandria Transit Company Boardroom, 3000 Business Center Drive, Alexandria, Virginia. Electronic access will be provided in either event. The meeting can be accessed by the public via Zoom and Facebook. Public comment may be made if participating via Zoom. A Zoom registration link is available on the DASH website, and requests for public comment can be made using the Q&A or chat feature. This meeting is being recorded. I think we need to record this statement. That's a mouthful to read every month, but we'll carry on with the briefing.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Board of Directors, it's good to see you. The briefing that I have here is in advance of our regular business because we received guidance from the City Attorney's Office by way of an announcement for all boards and commissions to ensure that we're in compliance with the city's and state requirements for electronic meetings. So in your board packet, I provided the details of the information that was provided to us from the city. As Chairman Kaplan mentioned, one of the requirements is that the statement be read at the beginning of the meeting to indicate the purpose of the meeting and the fact that we're in compliance with regulations and it is being held electronically. There are a couple of highlights that I wanted to make sure I point out to each of you that are critical for us to understand as are required in accordance with the law. Number one is that the meeting is treated the same as if the meeting is in person. As likewise, any conversation or information that is conveyed is public domain, and the information is presented, of course, is public. So we would just ask you to keep that in mind. The meeting is broadcasted and recorded, and we do post the meeting information and details on our website, as well as the full recording for people to review. We ask that when you're in the meeting that you would avoid distractions and other activities, again, referencing as if we were in person. One of the notes that they made on there was to check your camera to make sure there's adequate lighting behind your camera so that your face can be seen. One of the points here is that there are often attendees who may be audibly or visually impaired, and they rely on the audio, your face, the movement of your mouth, and other cues to understand and follow along with what's being discussed. Now, we've recently added the subtitle captioning, which you're seeing at the bottom of your screen. This is done automatically by the computer, so it's not 100% accurate, but to the degree that you can enunciate what you're saying and you'll see the captions coming up, that will help you to understand whether the computer is picking up your voice well enough to transcribe what you're saying. But nonetheless, audio and video need to be verified for each meeting. We would ask that you mute your microphone when you're not speaking. This is because when the video is shown to attendees, they see the screen that we see and they only see the person who's speaking. So if there's noise from someone and someone else is speaking, the video will flip between who's making the background noise and who's actually speaking, which can be troublesome. Sometimes you'll be looking at someone who's not actually the person speaking. One of the things that I didn't realize is the state law requires that your camera be kept on at all times while you are present in the meeting. Your audio can be muted, but you must have your camera on. The law stipulates that if you're not visible, you are not considered as present as a part of the quorum, and you are not considered as present as a part of attending the discussion. Again, you can mute. If you do need to step away, the guidance from the city attorney was that you would notify the chairman that you need to step away and turn off your camera. But again, this is one of the stipulations they wrote in order to ensure a quorum is kept, met, and maintained throughout the duration of the meeting. So we'll monitor that on the staff side. Staff only need to come off mute and on video when presenting, but the board members themselves are required. And the quorum, just as a reminder, is 6 members. So 6 members to meet the quorum requirements must be visible and participating at all times. As a side note, we've provided Chairman Kaplan a new device, a new computer to join us. It seems to be working well for you, David. Hopefully you're able to get the gallery view so that you're also able to see all of the members so that will hopefully help you to pick up on when individuals want to chime in. But one of the recommendations was take yourself off of mute or to wave your hand to interject and let someone know you want to participate. So again, all of the details and specifics of exactly what was provided to us is included in your board packet, and I would just ask that you review that. The last item I wanted to cover here was just some Zoom basics. In the event that you're noticing that either the computer is not picking up well what you're saying, or others indicate it's difficult to hear you, a recommendation we have is to click this arrow, next to the mute and unmute button that you see here on the screen, and that will bring up this audio settings bar. When you get to that, you'll notice that your microphone has a checkbox where it says automatically adjust volume. Sometimes some types of microphones don't pick up well how much volume they should add, so you can turn that off by unchecking that and drag this bar up, and that will cause you to be louder in the meeting, and that will cause your voice to be amplified at a higher level. Those are what I wanted to contribute, Mr. Chairman. Again, I would just ask members to please review the packet, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to help answer them. Oops, you're still muted. Also, before you move forward, Mr. Chairman, I have a point that I've also been able to add a timer in the event of a public speaker so that they can see how much time they have remaining.
Just Josh, the question I was asking, the slides you just showed us, those I didn't see those in the packet. Would you be able to send those out to us?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so the slides are just an abbreviated version of pages 2 and 3 of the board packet. So agenda number 1A has the procedure, the access requirements, and then the guidelines that are required in association with managing the meeting. But I'll be happy to, we will, again, after this meeting, we'll send all of you the PowerPoint and PDF as well, if that's helpful.
Okay. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. So we'll go ahead and move forward with public comment. I'll ask staff if anyone has asked to be recognized.
We did not have any submissions on the forum in advance, but we do have a participant who would like to provide public comment who is on the Zoom call right now.
Okay, is that Jeremy?
Yes.
Okay, Jeremy, if you're ready, we'll go ahead and recognize you for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry I cannot give you video to go with this. I didn't realize that I would need that. So first of all, I want to commend the board. You guys are doing a fantastic job, and Dash and staff are doing a fantastic job responding to COVID-19. Really appreciate it a lot. I wanted to just make a couple comments as we're coming upon New Year, and as I'm not as familiar as I probably should be with everything that's happening with Dash. As a public transit user and a blind person who depends on public transit to get around the city, I would just ask that we try to eliminate cutting services on our main routes, especially our feeder routes into Metro and into the subway system. These are key routes that are, yes, subsidized and can be worked around with Uber and Lyft and all those great services. But I would just recommend that we try to watch the cuts that we're making and the budget cuts that have to be made, and continue to do a good job of responding to COVID-19 restrictions and working to enforce or educate people on how to do those. Specifically, I live on Duke Street in the West End. The more buses that we can get interacting, especially with the Van Dorn corridor, would be really appreciated in this particular neighborhood. And the more that we can ensure that busing is connecting into the bike share stations that are going in, and that was approved by City Council, I believe, in October or November. Those are things that I'd love for the board to keep on its purview. And I'll be looking for ways to get more involved. And I'm sorry I didn't realize I was going to have to go first, or else I probably would have prepared something a little bit better. So keep up the great work. Let volunteers know how we can help. And hopefully I'll leave my information in the chat, but maybe if someone wants to engage me to help, I'd love to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. We've actually met before. I go to BPAC meetings on occasion, so we've met a couple of times. Although, admittedly, my attendance hasn't always been great. But I thank you for your comments. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at tonight's agenda, but there is a commuter choice grant application that actually would support some enhanced service on what is now we call the AT1 Plus, which serves much of the West End from Van Dorn, would actually be extended to Pentagon. So we're hoping to get some money from the 395 express lanes to support that.
Well, whatever voting is needed to do that, please do it.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
And just, staff will have your email, and, we send out alerts. And so as we have more information, we send out, the board packet and information on our meetings, but also as we go through the budget process. And if, we do face choices because of funding reductions, there will be a lot of opportunities for public engagement, and we'll make sure that you're aware of those. And
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any other speakers?
Does not look like it.
Okay, we'll go ahead and close public comment and move on to our second agenda item, which is approval of the minutes from last month. Are there any, they were included in our agenda packet, are there any corrections or revisions? And if not, I'll entertain a motion to approve them. Would somebody like to make
yeah, Mr. Chair, I move to approve the minutes from our November meeting.
Second.
Second.
Thank you, Matt. Is there a second? Is that Jeff?
Yes.
Okay. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. I'm thinking that there may be a bit of a delay on my end because I heard a lot of you say aye, but it came in after I'd asked for opposed or abstentions. So just forgive me if sometimes it seems like we might be talking over each other. I've had some issues with a slower internet connection, but hopefully that will resolve as we go forward through the meeting. All right, we'll go on to our next agenda item, which is the chairman's report. I don't have a specific report for tonight, but just one item I wanted to bring to your attention just in terms of the calendar, which is that February will be here soon. And that's when, according to our bylaws, we have the annual stockholder meeting with City Council. And one of the duties is to appoint the board. We all serve one-year terms that are renewable. And so we will be asking after the holidays as we put together the slate. Usually it's the, well, it's one of the two Tuesday council meetings in February. It'll be virtual this year, I'm sure. We're waiting to hear a date from the city manager, but we'll be polling board members to make sure that folks want to continue serving. And hopefully at that meeting, the city manager will bring forward someone to replace Lisa Henty as one of the staff appointments. So we'll be back, with full complement of 3 city staff. The other, announcement is just something to be aware of, and I'm sure you all are because it's all over the media about some of the challenges that WMATA is facing. And Hillary, I know, addresses this in her TNES director's report. The proposed general manager's budget is dire, has consequences that we've never seen before in this region in terms of transit. Now, there are certainly on the federal government ways to avoid that. And certainly what happens with WMATA will impact us as well. One of the things that I asked Josh earlier whether there was sort of a letter or something we could sign on that transit systems are doing to encourage Congress to pass federal funding. It sounds like, at least right now, that because there are some negotiations going on, they're sort of waiting to see what figure comes out as to whether it's adequate. But we should certainly be prepared in the winter when WMATA starts their public comment process to comment there. And if there is an appropriate letter for us to sign on, or one that we should send on our own to congressional leadership, I think that we need to be very forward thinking and out there in terms of expressing the dire need that transit in this region is facing. So certainly would ask all of you, who are plugged into, the transit community professionally, to keep an eye out for any opportunities we might have to, advocate. And also knowing that our local delegation has been very strong on this. And I think Josh had shared with some information about Senator Payne Warner giving a briefing on transit, where particularly Senator Payne spoke in very strong terms about understanding, what is needed. And that's encouraging. But, let's, be thinking about ways we can help there. That's all I have. Do we have, I think we'll go on to the TNES director's report.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The first item I did have on here was the WMATA budget, but maybe we'll do that one last because I feel like that's where we might have more discussion. So let me just jump into the next one. WMATA is doing some repairs on the blue line that's going to impact service in Alexandria. So they'll actually be doing work between King Street and Van Dorn over 10 weekends. But then they'll also be closing the Van Dorn and Franconia Springfield stations on weekdays around the holidays to kind of capitalize on low ridership and be able to get some of the work done when people aren't using Metro as much. So they'll have some buses to shuttle people, but this track work, by closing the stations on the weekends, it will cut the project's completion time in half, which is, I think, a good thing for transit riders. Hopefully pending our future discussion about if Metro stations will even be open. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was the Transit Ridership Incentive Program. So it's called the TRIP program. This is actually a really exciting new program that was created in the 2020 General Assembly. So it's basically a program to improve transit service for urbanized areas. So for jurisdictions with over 100,000 people in population, and it's also focused on equity and reducing barriers to transit for low-income individuals. The program provides $25 million a year, so substantial opportunities for funding, and $5 million of those are dedicated to operating costs to reduce congestion in urban areas. So I think that we would be a good candidate for those. And there's a lot of grants out there for capital improvements, but not a lot for operating assistance, which is, kind of a hit to our general budget. So that's a really exciting part of this particular grant. The DRPT actually issued a request for ideas, which the city and Dash will be responding to about types of projects we might want to apply for before the application comes out in 2021. We're not sure the exact date, but we'll certainly be bringing that to the board for discussion when that does come out. The grant, so 75% of the grant goes to enhancing regional connectivity, so supporting transit operations. But then 25% of the grant goes to supporting zero fare and low income pilot programs. So that is definitely something that I think we would be interested in and probably applying for some funding for that portion of the grant. So it's a great new opportunity to get some funding for the transit system and hopefully, help us implement some of the enhancements with the ATV. Just an update on our low income fare policy that we mentioned. Last month we talked about it. Foursquare Consulting was the consulting firm that was selected for that. And the draft report is expected in the spring around April. Next, we have the Virginia Rail Passenger Authority. So this is a new group that was initiated. They had their first meeting in November. And it's a new authority that's going to take over the kind of administrative and fiduciary responsibilities for the state-sponsored rail service. Ralph Northam had passed a $3.7 billion Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative. And so that will double Amtrak and DRE service in Virginia over the next decade. So this group is really kind of tasked with implementing that vision and the infrastructure and capital expansion projects that go along with that. And we do have a lot of representation from Northern Virginia on that group. And then lastly, let's talk briefly about the WMATA budget. As Chairman Kaplan mentioned, the general manager's budget came out last week. WMATA has announced an operating deficit of about $500 million due to low ridership projections and uncertainty of what kind of federal aid is going to be available and timing of a vaccine. So they are proposing some service changes that would be a really big hit to transit in Northern Virginia, particularly in a time when we are going to be struggling already to get people out of their cars and back onto transit as they start going back to work. They are looking at mass layoffs of about 2,400 employees. They're looking at restricting Metro Rail operations. So the Metro will close at 9 p.m. on weekdays. There would be no weekend rail service. There would be 30-minute headways on all lines and 19 closed stations, which would include the Van Dorn Metro Station and Eisenhower in Alexandria. So that's a huge hit right there, particularly knowing that we're also trying to get people back on transit, and a lot of people use Dash to access those Metro Rail stations for commuter purposes. They've also proposed a reduction to 41 bus service lines. In Alexandria, they're looking at only having 3 lines, but they would keep those lines operating pretty functionally, so that not having 1 hour headways on multiple lines, but actually keeping service up, but only having those 3 lines. So there's more certainly in that whole package, but those are the kind of the big ticket items that really will impact Alexandria. So they have a meeting, the board will review this and have a public hearing at their December 10th meeting. So that's tomorrow. So I don't know if Josh, if you have anything you wanted to say about this or chime in, but we can certainly discuss it and I'll try and answer any questions that you all might have.
Yeah, I'm certainly happy to add that we are in very regular contact and having a lot of discussion with WMATA about this. Obviously, this is substantial. We recognize the significance of this and how much of an impact it could have not only on Alexandria, but the entire region. I will say that I've been in contact with Paul Wiedefeld several times. We've talked about this specifically. You know, the reality is this is what they're facing, and there's just no solution to this unless there's congressional action. And obviously, you know, we'll talk later in the meeting here a little bit about my recommendations related to fare collection, but as sort of a tie into that and tie into WMATA, you know, there seems to be some positive progress. At least people are talking about it, but whether you're optimistic on that or not, certainly understand both positions. But just as WMATA is doing, we are doing the same in the sense of planning for the worst. And I think that this is a picture of really what the worst could be if nothing changes. So just want to make sure the board is aware that, you know, we as transportation entities are keeping in touch, and our planning staff, of course, are talking on the regular as well.
Josh, this is Matt. Just a quick question. If this is a permanent or a temporary issue with the 3 lines within Alexandria, I'm wondering, not to, you know, make something good out of a bad situation, but is there a way we could pick up the slack or the need for maybe excess, you know, seats on those 3 lines?
You know, I think that's a good question, and certainly one that we've anticipated. I don't really have an answer for you tonight. Martin, at some point, will be able to probably talk a little bit more about that. But I think to directly answer your question, we don't really have the means to substitute for any removed Metro bus service. But with that said, one of the distinct advantages we've seen to the fact that we're still moving forward with the ATV, the Transit Vision Plan, is that additional mobility within the community and other connections are going to benefit our community and hopefully help mitigate some of the effects of this. Obviously, it doesn't, you know, completely, but you know, it is in line that our ATV will also help people to be able to continue to move around, even at a reduced implementation from what we had hoped it would be pre-COVID. But I would just ask, I know Martin is listening in, I would ask Martin to note this, and maybe he can, Matt, for you when he comes up in his planning section, maybe he can also incorporate some additional information for you on that.
And Hillary, I just had a question for clarification purposes. So along with this budget, doesn't it also require the city to actually pay more than they do now to WMATA?
So every year the city, we have a 3% cap on our operating subsidy. So the city, despite all the reduction in service, the city would be paying our full amount to WMATA because the reduction is really coming from fare revenue loss. So yes, the city would pay our full WMATA budget, and this would be the service we would be getting.
And with a 3% cap on top, 3% increase because they're exercising, right? It's sobering. Any other questions for Hillary? I guess I would just ask Hillary before we move on in terms of, you know, to the comments I made earlier about responses to this, how is the city organizing and are they doing anything at this point in terms of advocacy related to transit needs?
I think right now we're, you know, this is just going to the WMATA board tomorrow. We're watching to see what happens. This again, it's, you know, it's worst case scenario. It's also how we plan our budgets, kind of like the discussion we had last month with you all. You know, they're planning for the worst, and I think our next steps would be kind of going through all of their cuts and thinking through our priority asks. So prioritizing what's most important to the city. So when we are ready to respond, we can do so in a way that kind of prioritizes what we think the top concerns are. Certainly city and Dash staff work together on all of that, and hopefully the city and this board would be in alignment on those priorities as well. So we're not quite there yet on commenting. I mean, like Josh mentioned, you know, he's been talking to his counterparts, and so have we. But we are waiting a little bit to see kind of what happens at the WMATA board. This is just the first kind of release of the service cuts.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, if not, we'll ask if there are other board members who want to make announcements related to commissions or organizations with which you serve. No? Okay. I do want to thank staff. This is, oh, Larry, go ahead.
Larry Chambers here, just reporting out from the Transportation Commission meeting last month. Just wanted to make everyone aware that there will be a public hearing December 16th on the 2020 long range plan. Also, we discussed the potential for 10% cuts to Dash and what that can mean in terms of reduced service, and the commission expressed a deep concern around that. And I think at this next meeting, we'll be discussing a letter to the city manager to see how we can support Dash should deeper cuts be necessary.
All right, that's great. Thank you. All right, and we'll go ahead and move on to general manager reports.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My report begins, reference some page numbers here for you in your packet if you'd like to follow along. Give me just a moment. My report begins on page 9 of your board packet. Here I have on the screen for you just quick service update related to COVID-19, letting you know that we continue to operate under the same status with our modified weekday service. We have seen a few additional cases pop up within the workforce. We have been actively contact tracing these cases. Our system seems to be working quite well. I will give kudos to the team led by Stephanie Salzone, our safety and security manager, who has been doing this since the beginning of the pandemic. And we have found in every case that the tracing has led us not to a workplace exposure, but rather to outside of the workplace, typically within the family. But this gives you a sense of how we're doing. And you can see that comparatively to what our typical ridership would be, we're hovering around 40%. That dips and goes up periodically, but it's between 35 and 40% of typical ridership. The next item is a little more substantial of a discussion. I've distributed to you yesterday a memorandum. Hopefully you've all received that and had a chance to read it. I'm going to step through that, our customer fare survey, and provide some personal perspectives informed by the advice of my team and public health officials in regards to my recommendation to the board in consideration of taking up the issue of reinstating fare collection. As you know, over the past couple of meetings, we've alluded to the fact that this meeting would be a decision point in the event that a restoration of fares to be collected on Dash buses and resuming use of the front door of the vehicles for boarding passengers, that this would be a decision point for a January implementation. I'll just start out by reminding you that we understand that WMATA, Metro Bus, and Metro Rail anticipate reinstating fare collection on or around January 3rd. There are many other regional providers, and I do have some information on the slide here in a few minutes to talk about what their status is and what their plan is. I want to start out before I get into the content by highlighting one of the most key points here as it relates to action on this item this evening. while we've been tracking and pursuing the procurement and installation of driver barriers on our fleet, we are still lacking the delivery of that equipment. We have less than a dozen on site, if maybe not even a half dozen of these products have been delivered for a fleet of 100 buses. We've been planning to have these installed sometime late in December, if not early January, to be able to have the fleet out there operating with driver barriers in place. So from a purely logistical standpoint on this matter, it's important for the board to understand that we're pretty far off from a January rollout of these barriers. Now, it could be that these arrive suddenly late in the month or early in January, but then we still have installation time, and we're going to be performing that in-house. We're coming up on the holidays, so quite frankly, our ability to meet this timeline is severely limited. Now, the memorandum that I distributed to you yesterday was last minute in nature, largely because this continues to be a moving target. Every day we're hearing different numbers. We're hearing increases in infections in the pandemic. And the reality is it's worse than it was back in March. And the level of spread has been significant. Now, our community has been incredible with this, and frankly, comparatively to the rest of the country, we're doing quite well. But the reason for my last minute sort of change of thought on this has a lot to do with that. And it has a lot to do with the reality of what we're facing today as compared to what we were a week and a month ago. So I'm going to run through some of the information, and then I welcome any and all questions, comments, debate, and those in favor and those against my position here. It's welcome, and I think it's important. It's important for me and my staff to hear. I've also asked several members of my team to be available, and they are currently on the phone, on the Zoom, and they will be prepared to come off mute and further contribute as necessary. So the first thing I want to show you here is our customer survey results. As I mentioned, we went out in person, largely our supervisors and some bus operators did a great job going out and engaging our community and finding out from them what is their position in regards to fare collection, riding our buses, and the trade-off, considering that deferring fare collection means a larger deficit in the coming year. So we were able to obtain 222 total individual unique responses. These were taken of riders at Dash bus stops. So these are not online submissions. These are in person. The first chart that you see here on the screen is question number 1 of 3. And that is, how would your Dash usage change if we began collecting fares again? What we found is that 73% of the respondents would continue to ride the same amount as they do today, regardless of fare collection. What that indicates to me is we have a lot of transit dependent riders out there. It would mean that they don't really have a choice. If budgets are tight, they are going to have to find a way to make it work. Now, there's a lot of different ways to read into the data. That's just my take, but I present it as we've received it. The other options for answering the question were I would stop riding Dash completely, I would ride less, or I'm just not sure. And typically a not sure answer means they really aren't clear as to what the question might be, or maybe they just haven't thought about it enough to know what they would do. But we certainly have suspected that there are a lot of people out there riding who are transit dependent. The second question was if Dash had to reduce service on some routes, this not being specific to the individual rider or what route they were riding, in order to continue allowing all passengers to ride for free, would you support that decision? Again, the majority answered yes, that they would support that decision, implying that in their eyes, it is more important to continue to have a fare-free service relative to a reduction in service. So that was an interesting find. But quite honestly, the most significant question is the third one. And that is, if Dash had to reduce service on your route, less frequency, less coverage, whatever the case may be, and you had to wait longer to catch the bus in order to continue with free fares, would you support that decision? And just over half of the respondents said yes. So again, you can interpret the data and the responses however you might, but what we have seen and what we believe this to be indicating is that the people that are out there riding the buses right now are relying heavily on a fare-free service. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk to you about my recommendation regarding reinstating fares. And that takes this as a factor, but that this is not the deciding factor in my recommendation. My recommendation is based on health and exposures. So I'm going to run through some of my factors of what I'm recommending here. And then just got a few slides, and then I'll pause and we can go back to any of these and talk about any of the data and any questions you might have. So my formal opinion and recommendation on this is to defer this decision to re-implement fares. Previously, we had been talking about the board going ahead and taking action to reinstate fares at this meeting. If that is the action the board decides to take, very much respect that and very much will support that decision, and we will execute it under the direction of the board staff. What I would ask you to understand is, independent of whether we defer or take it up now, if it is decided to move forward with reinstating fares, I need it to be clear to the board that I would have to ask you to allow us to determine that date at a later time, because we simply can't determine the date as to when we would be able to begin collecting fares because of what I mentioned before about the lack of driver barriers and when we will have those installed. So my first factor here is simply that I do feel like the message here is mixed in relation to public health officials' recommendations. We're continuing to see restrictions put back in place, reductions in capacity, and the discouraging of any kind of social interactions. So by reinstating front door boarding and re-engaging the fare collection process, I feel like that runs contrary to the advice that we're being given. Of course, the cases are at all-time high, and collecting fares does encourage a level of interaction, typically with fares that don't work, fare cards that don't read, and when drivers have to stop a boarding passenger. A potential increase in exposure and subsequent absences as a result of exposures and contact tracing, and the necessity of quarantining operators because of that could increase and affect our ability to provide the level of service we need to. As I mentioned, driver barriers arriving at a slower pace than originally anticipated. The estimated revenue losses, in other words, what Evan has accounted for from a revenue perspective in restoring fares in January, as opposed to restoring them in March, is estimated to not to exceed $280,000. Now, I'll remind the board that whatever we use of CARES Act money now, we have to make up for in the future. So I acknowledge and admit that this is kicking the can down the road and could potentially present a more significant, more challenging situation in regards to service adjustments, cuts, or layoffs. I acknowledge that. Revenue losses being accounted for in the CARES Act funding doesn't totally use the remaining CARES money, but it certainly would cut into it more than reinstating fares. Again, the thing we don't know is what the ridership will truly drive as far as fare collection, even when it is reinstated. The vaccine development and news about vaccines has been very, very promising. We're hopeful to see the vaccine approved this week, if not early next. We understand that transit workers are considered essential. And whether they're classified as phase 1B or phase 2, they're still going to be in the top 3 groups to be receiving this vaccine. So the potential here is that we could see immunization going on fairly quickly within DASH. And optimistically, I would hope that by January, February, we start to have access and we could have the majority of our staff vaccinated by March. Again, I have no way to know whether that's actually going to be the case, and I don't have any role in that, but that's just my professional kind of take on that based off of what I've heard. And then the last couple of bullets here are that I am optimistic regarding the bipartisan relief package that's been discussed. I recognize that in our current political environment, nothing is guaranteed. It's not even guaranteed in a smooth political environment, let alone the one we're in right now. But I am more optimistic about this than I have been in the news we've heard about the past. I acknowledge, and as the chairman pointed out, and I really appreciate him pointing out the importance of advocating for the funding and also recognizing that the bills that are out there right now do not nearly hit the level that transit needs in order to avoid these massive cuts. But I acknowledge that there is certainly some optimism there that there will be something coming in. I'm also optimistic about the fact that these bills include money for the city and for localities, which is so desperately needed for Alexandria. I included in the board packet, in the board memorandum that was distributed. And if you're watching this meeting and you haven't yet seen that materials, note that all of this material is always posted on our website following the meeting, is public material. There is a letter from our union, our ATU leadership in support of this, and they are sharing my concerns. I had a conversation with the president of our local, and he shared these concerns with me. And the last couple of items here is, although we're not completely in alignment here, and I acknowledge that if the board did take this step, we would be sort of out of step with other regional providers. Most are intending to resume fare collection in January. Many are following the lead of WMATA, and I recognize and understand why. A lot of it is financial, and we also are facing financial challenges here. But that's what I know about what they're doing. I did allude to the fact that I would let you know what we know about what our regional providers are doing. Up here on the screen, I've got a list of the folks that we have talked with, whether it's different DASH staff or myself. Loudoun County, they remain fare free until May. PRTC and OmniRide, they're going to keep fare free service for their local service, with express service collecting only smart trip, no cash. Arlington plans to resume fare collection in lockstep with Metrobus, as does Fairfax Q. The best we understand from Fairfax County is that we would assume they would follow Metrobus, but it's not clear to us exactly what they plan to do, and they've not made any formal public announcements about that at this point. I know that we've got Jeff on here, and he may be able to elaborate on this, but what we know of the people that we have talked with at Circulator is they are also working on the barrier issue, and that their fare collection would resume based on when those are in place. And Jeff, I'll let you jump in here in a minute and let me know if I'm wrong on that. And then Montgomery County Ride-On, they are also working on the driver barriers. They're looking at early February, but Metrobus, I think, is going to be very set on January. So that's kind of where we are. I was also asked whether Arlington and Fairfax already have these barriers. And the answer is that Arlington has gotten them, and they've gotten them installed. They didn't have them previously. And Fairfax, as we understand it, does have these barriers as well, or at least is working on them. So dependent upon how important that information is to you all, please state any questions you have, and my staff can help fill in or correct any misstatements on my part. So that's kind of my, my synopsis. And I'm happy to monitor my screen for your questions and comments, or Mr. Chairman, I'm also happy to turn it over to you for your management of the comments and questions.
Yes, sir.
So I see Ian, and then I see Larry have both put their hands up, and then Linda. So Ian, Larry, and Linda.
Can you give me an idea of the timeline for installation? Let's say we receive it, mid-December or third week in December. How long will it take to be in place?
That's a good question, Ian. And frankly, my answer to that question is there's so much uncertainty that I'm concerned about putting a timeline on it. And part of it is that we're still working through the installation technical details of the installation for staff. So our maintenance team has the first set, and they're going through the installation process now. So once they kind of learn it and start to do it, yes, it could probably proceed at a quick rate. But these are big doors. They're hefty. They're made of metal and plexiglass. They have a number of stanchions and bolts and rivets that have to be done in order to put them in place. And they're all part of the other challenges because we have a mixed fleet. We're likely to see the barriers for our new flyer produced buses first, which is a relatively small fraction of our fleet. They're our newest buses, with the older buses having to be engineered to fit by the supplier. But one of the big factors here for me in leaving that date blank is because I don't like to put a timeline on something when I'm missing all of the pieces of the puzzle, if that makes sense.
Understood. And I ask because even though the report did not definitively say what was driving factors for Arlington and Fairfax, I'm wondering how much did that play into their decision to go forth in January?
Right. I think that's a good question. It's hard to know without knowing the inner workings of how their decision-making process is happening. I think by default, a number of systems just generally tend to follow what Metro Bus is doing.
Okay.
So then I think we had Larry.
Hi, thanks, Josh. So if we're not going to have these barriers by January, then I think the plan that you've just briefed is really the only way forward. It's not only it only makes business sense in terms of what you brought up in terms of quarantine and people not come to work. But it's also the only humane way forward. We're right around the corner from a vaccine. We have a duty to keep our people who are our frontline drivers here. We got a duty to keep them safe and get them through to where they can get that vaccine in the early part of next year. We're already facing budget challenges. We know we're going to face some either way. I see no reason to risk lives to get the bus operating with fares just a couple of months earlier. And I guess my second part, that was a statement. The second part is just a question. I'm just interested in how Fairfax and Arlington were able to get the barriers in time for the January deadline. And just any background you might have there about what our challenges are in terms of the logistical supply chain getting them to Alexandria.
Thank you. I will see if Ray or Evan want to speak a little bit to that. But Ray, correct me if I'm wrong, Fairfax may have been ordering their buses with these and having them built accordingly, or am I wrong on that?
Yeah, I'm a little less tuned in with Fairfax. My understanding is that the majority of their fleet already have had barriers. I'm not sure if it was directly in response to this pandemic or not. And I can touch a little bit on Arlington. They are using they're using a local in-state provider, which I believe is not one of the more popular or more common manufacturers of barriers, which we have selected. The barrier provider we have selected is one of the top tier, more widely used barriers, which, as you can imagine, is receiving a lot of business and volume these days, and therefore we're seeing the supply challenges of the throughput of this particular manufacturer.
And Raymond, I might add just really briefly, we actually were just conversing with the manufacturer this afternoon, and we should have an ETA in the morning for our delivery. And, you know, as is appropriate through the general manager, we may be able to provide the board additional updates on the timeline.
Yeah, and I would just, state that when we specified these barriers, we wanted to make sure they were something that were long-term durable for the life of the bus, as opposed to something made of a lightweight plastic that would have to be removed. These actually have the ability to be used to help protect the drivers from a physical attack as well. And they have a sliding window as opposed to a fixed window. They also have been proven not to interfere with visibility, which is a problem with some of the more short-term, I guess, solutions that you might see.
Got it. Thank you for the comprehensive answer.
Certainly. Then I noticed on my screen, Linda had put her hand up.
Thanks. I had a couple things. I think I generally support your recommendation. I think the one other aspect that I think we shouldn't underestimate is that this is also a time of economic hardship for a lot of people, and during COVID. So keeping it free during this very hot time in terms of viral spread, I think is probably going to give us additional benefits in terms of goodwill with the public as well. And I think it makes sense health-wise, and given the fact that we don't have the material yet, it seems like maybe they'll be installed around the time of the next board meeting, at which point we could change our timeline and either not wait for the vaccine or something else. So that would be what I would think about.
Thank you.
So let me ask colleagues and see if we can get a sense of the board on this. I'm hearing that we certainly want to wait until the barriers are installed, and Linda just said we'll defer and bring back at the next board meeting. Are folks wanting to see a longer term fare free, or are we comfortable with once these measures are in place to look towards reinstituting fares? So I think that's important guidance that staff needs.
Is it either or, David? I mean, can we vote to extend it to March, and then if things don't change sufficiently, extend it further?
We can, yeah. I mean, that's an option that we have. I think one of the, Josh and I had some conversation about this. One of the concerns I have is, I had told Josh I was a little less optimistic on the stimulus than he is, because I want to see first how we get through funding the government for the remainder of the year and whether this is attached to it. And so far the best I think we're going to get is a 1-week extension right now. And changes, we'll know what happens with the Senate hopefully in early January. But if the House and the Senate kind of stay where they are, well, if the bill can't get out of Congress, then even the change in parties of a president may not necessarily get us to a better outcome on this. And I am a little concerned the longer we keep going, digging ourselves in terms of denying any revenue. And albeit 275,000 is not anywhere close to what we were collecting over about a 2-month period, but it is not insignificant given the exercise we went through last month. It's probably about 10% of what that hypothetical 10% cut was that we ran through, maybe slightly less. Staff can remind me, but I do want to be clear that we could end up the longer we delay collecting fares, I think we have some challenges in terms of if the money doesn't come through, because we're going to leave a lot of very painful choices for FY22 potentially. And I wonder if it makes sense for us to go, because when we suspended fares, those of you who are on the board in the spring, the decision was we do this kind of as a region. And we saw Josh lay out that most of our surrounding, the provider WMATA, who serves the city, is going back to it. Arlington and Fairfax, who are the two services that people are primarily within Alexandria transferring to, if not Metrobus, are going back to it. Does it make sense to do it as soon as we are able to keep employees safe, so that way we are not cutting off the revenue? That's one of the concerns that I have about when we revisit it later. But I'd like to hear from colleagues about a way forward, although I do think the sense I'm hearing is that we are not going to make a decision to reinstitute tonight because we don't have information on the barriers.
So I think immediately at the current instance, Linda made a strong point about extending goodwill to our passengers. Also, on the other side of that, when Josh went through the reasons and his analysis of whether folks would continue to pay, I would say no one would put themselves on a bus, in this environment unless they really needed to. So I don't see it as an issue collecting fares once again. But I do think at this moment, we do need to demonstrate that the passengers, their safety is paramount.
Josh, this is Steve. If you had the barriers installed as of today, would your recommendation change at all from the proposal that you shared with us just now?
No.
Okay.
No, largely because it is one of multiple factors. I acknowledge the value of the barriers, but my position is more coming from a position of discouraging opportunities for the necessity of interaction, or creating situations under which the workforce may be put under additional exposure risks if it's something we can avoid, while acknowledging, as I mentioned, it's kicking the can, and the big issue here is the money and what it does for us down the road potentially.
Okay, because I know WMATA had barriers installed on their operating stations, primarily for security purposes, if not solely for security purposes, on their entire fleet. And whether or not the two other properties you mentioned did have barriers for the same reasons, I don't know. So their decision to move forward, I think, may have some different characteristics than ours. But as I think back to the discussions that the board had in the spring, when we made the decision to cease the collection of fares, we were driven by a health imperative. The main reason for that was to minimize contact for the benefit of the health of not just our operators, our employees, but also the passengers that were required to use our service in their day-to-day operation. And I think we need to remain supportive of that, since not much of anything has changed. The external environment has not yet improved to a point where the vaccine, obviously, there's a ray of sunshine on the horizon, but the logistics of having not just the class 1, class 2 employee or populations provided with the vaccine, that will take some time. So I think it may be to the agency's advantage to at least consider this, keeping the same condition through the end of January, possibly to the end of February, but having the same discussion in January to see what has changed externally, as well as the status of the barriers, which would provide some help from a risk management perspective.
Thank you. And Steve, I would just note that it's my understanding that Metro bus vehicles, and maybe Ray, being our most knowledgeable person on staff about capital equipment, their fleet largely, if not 100%, has always been equipped with these barriers, but they've been there for the purpose of attack because of WMATA's operating environment and safety issues with drivers. But Ray, am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. I think they've been primarily there for security purposes, and they've had them since before the pandemic.
I see Jim's hand up.
First of all, I have a process question, which is, Mr. Chairman, do we need to do a motion and to vote on a decision here, or do you just need a sense of the board? And I guess this is to Josh too.
Yeah. So if the board takes no action and there's no motion and there's nothing done formally tonight, we remain in the same status as we've been. So that continues until revoked. So, so to defer action on this would simply be a consensus-driven thing that require no formal motion or anything. You would just say no one's presenting a motion to reinstate fares.
Understood.
But you
Okay.
can't, Jim, also, but you can, if you want to define something, for example, if you wanted to stipulate that that staff is required to ensure this is brought back, say in February, or that it becomes a required agenda item at a future meeting, you could stipulate that your motion might defer such action and for the board to bring up a decision point at a certain point. But you can also just handle that through feedback. It's fine too.
I mean, I've heard all the, I think points of view here and align with a lot of what's been said by my colleagues. I think everyone's being very thoughtful about it. I think Josh, you're being very thoughtful as well as the staff. I guess I would suggest we add this to it as on the agenda for the next meeting as well, and sort of get the update from you. I guess maybe I lean maybe slightly in David's direction in terms of my concern about the sort of the balance between ensuring that we are collecting fares at a reasonable time and protecting safety. And I do wonder, you had the list up before about the DC circulator. I think the fares being reinstated contingent upon the protective features being deployed. I like that myself because it suggests that we have on principle a position, which is, once the safety features are there, then we support the fares coming back online. We would all have to actually, believe that be the principle. There are other principles at stake, as Linda noted, just about making things affordable even longer, for folks in the community. I don't feel strongly we need to make that decision at this meeting, but I think it would be worth bringing this back up in January, getting an update on where we are on the installations, and also maybe seeing what some of the other jurisdictions have done or not done as they've been planning to do in the January timeframe.
Certainly, and I'm happy to just mention to Beth, our secretary, that the minutes would reflect these comments as well as yours that you just made in regards to bringing this back. Certainly happy to do that.
Anything else that needs to be said, or other points that we're not considering?
Just one more question. If we consider bringing fares back, is it possible to have a dollar amount, just an estimate, given the ridership that we think we have or would have? Just put a dollar amount so we could have something tangible to say, well, this is what we are foregoing, this is what we make.
Certainly. I think, Ian, I would do two things. One is that, and Evan, I know you're listening in, my recommendation would be that we would bring back projected fares based off of current ridership, and then projected fares adjusted for the sample of the feedback regarding ridership on this chart. So you could see both scenarios. Theoretical, of course. We don't have crystal ball here, but generally we would assume current ridership, which is approximately 35 to 40%. So we would assume collecting fares from them, but then we could also theoretically adjust for this sample. If that makes sense. So certainly we'll make a note of that as well, Ian, in the minutes to make sure we bring that to you.
Josh, I just
We would be
wanted to add from the city standpoint, I know it was really important for us to move forward with the other jurisdictions, but seeing that other jurisdictions are shifting their timeline as well and the driver barriers are in place, I think your recommendation does make sense, and I appreciate that you are acknowledging the potential cost in FY22, and I would just remind the board that that means we might have to make some tough tough decisions. We already know we have tough decisions in front of us for FY22, but if we are bringing in even less revenue, that's something that we do have to consider. So we should be weighing that in our options. But I think in terms of safety, not having driver barriers in place, and that other jurisdictions are kind of in the same place as us, and we're not all going to be able to go back to fare collection at the same time anyway. I think this recommendation makes sense.
Thank you, Hillary. We'll definitely make sure that we continue to take that very seriously.
And I'll just add that Board Member Thomas has had her hand up. I don't know if she had something she wanted to add.
I couldn't hear you. What?
Just want to make Board Member Thomas has had her hand up. Just wanted to make sure she had a chance to speak if she wanted to add something.
Thanks,
Sorry,
Hillary.
sure.
Ajayesha here. So yeah, I just wanted to comment that I did agree with your recommendation. I think health and safety of the operators and passengers is paramount. We saw a lot of travel during the Thanksgiving holiday, which I think is what we're seeing this spike currently with COVID across the country, because millions of people decided to get on a plane or travel and visit their family to have Thanksgiving dinner. And so I think the same we'll see that happening again with Christmas and other holidays at the end of the year. So I think I would like to see an update in probably February, because I think we'll probably see a spike in January. But I would agree with deferring fare collection until all the barriers are in place, because there's multiple factors, not just barriers. It's just also what is the climate, the COVID situation, and we're not expected to have massive vaccines until like the mid-year. And I recognize like the deficit for the budgets and stuff that we'll have to consider, but I think having more operators out because there's a quarantine going on, or they get sick, or worse, they may pass away, that'd be even more detrimental to Dash.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments very much. So, Mr. Chairman, unless there are additional comments, I think I have enough information of the feedback, unless you'd like to also add more, that we would capture both in the minutes as well as in our directions for future meetings, January and February, making sure that we continue to keep this on the agenda and keep you all briefed on the status of the barriers, as well as changes in the external environment related to COVID.
Yeah, I think we need to look at this on a month-by-month basis. So that sounds like a good plan going forward. And hopefully in January, you'll also be able, at least anecdotally, to get some feedback from the systems that are reinstituting the first week of January. So, you know, we may not have trends yet in ridership, but at least we'll know, well, how is this, some idea of how this is being received across the region as people go back to that, and, you know, how the operators are handling the interactions with passengers. You know, I just wanted to say, you know, as when I had read Josh's memo and he and I had a conversation today, one of the things I said to him is, I think on some of the messaging about, you know, and I think, you know, our conversation was very much focused around the barriers arriving, which I think is a good point. But if you kind of go beyond that and you look at, you know, as we start to get into, well, what's the interaction between the operators and the passengers, even through a barrier once you resume front door boarding, I wanted just to throw out there, somebody who is transit dependent, has continued to ride transit, at least, you know, some of the time to continue to get around. I think then you start to get into questions about, is it safe to be riding transit at all? Because, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had, when we were under stay-at-home order, we told people, you know, essential trips only. It even said that on the route, where the route would be posted on the front of the bus. And you know, we saw our ridership plummet considerably. We ran a lot less service. We even marked off seats for social distancing. So even as the front of the bus third was blocked off, then there were, even in the places where passengers could sit, not barriers, but there were signs saying, you know, don't sit here. You know, as we began to reopen, those signs came off. We stopped the stay-at-home, essential trips only messaging. But, you know, I'm just wondering, in terms of, you know, I think we'd have to be aware of the optics for people who ride transit about, you know, whether this starts to get into messaging about whether transit is safe to use. Because I was pointing out to Josh that, you know, the driver will have the barrier and may have to assist with an interaction. But, you know, right now, may very well on some of our buses that are a little more crowded because you've got so little space, even with 41% ridership, you've got people who are sitting, 6 feet or possibly less apart from each other. And although we're not interacting with each other, folks are talking on their cell phones, folks are talking to their companion. And so, there's still the spread there and of, potentially of taking on some risk. And I just think that, I would like to see us, think about, as we potentially look at more restrictions to flatten the curve here about, our messaging for transit and how we can make it as safe as possible. And if we need to go back to potentially some of those restrictions of having people distance more in our buses and whether our fleet could accommodate it. So just something for us to think about as we start to see how the pandemic unfolds as we go through the holidays.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's all I have. So thank you. That was a very good discussion. I appreciate everybody's participation in that. We'll go on to your other updates, Josh.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my updates. I just wanted to point out that we had another successful town hall as a part of our efforts to keep our workforce informed and to communicate with them in the best ways possible, considering the current situation with the pandemic. We'll continue to do those as well as other methods. And secondly, we have partnered with Volunteer Alexandria for holiday sharing. There is a link here on your page. It's dashbus.com/holiday 2020 if you would like to donate towards this important program. We normally would hold our Stuff a Bus event, but we aren't able to do that because of the current circumstances. So always like to share a little good news and something that is that we'd like to, appreciate the fact that the team is working on these things and that we are doing what we can to contribute back to our community. And that is all that I have, Mr. Chairman. If it's okay with you, I can pass it off to Evan.
Right. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. The financial update begins on page 12 of the board packet. And I'll be pretty brief tonight. Really, nothing has changed in our overall outlook since I spoke to you last month. But so I'll just go through it real quick and then please ask any questions that you have. We do have some scary looking numbers on the report in terms of a monthly and year-to-date deficit, a monthly deficit of a little over $1 million and a year-to-date deficit of 1.7 million. Again, the reason for that is just in our books, we have not transferred all the costs related to the 395 funded enhanced service to the appropriate grant accounts because we're waiting for those accounts to be appropriated, which should be happening within about a month or so in the city's process for doing that. And we're also working on transferring over all that CARES Act revenue that we've talked about to replace the passenger revenue that we're not collecting right now because fare collection is suspended. And so I'm actually working actively on that right now, and it just requires some actions to be taken in the city. And so once that happens, our books will show a surplus. To put some numbers on it, we've got about $785,000 in 395 grant reimbursements just through October, and 1.6 million in CARES transfers to replace our revenue, again, just through October. So if you put that together, we're looking at a surplus of over $700,000 through the end of October, rather than a $1.7 million deficit. So that's where we're at. Now, I say surplus just because it's the CARES Act transfers are really, it's what we thought we were going to make in revenue, less what we actually made in revenue. And as we approach the end of the year, we're going to adjust those transfers simply to bring Dash to zero for the year, so that we are only using the CARES Act dollars in fiscal 21 that we need to make Dash whole, and save every dollar that we possibly can to support the service that we want to run in fiscal year 2022, which begins next July. As the general manager just discussed, if we are returning to fare collection in March, and I estimated roughly the middle of March, the maximum amount of fare revenue that we might lose as a result of that deferring by 2.5 months is around $280,000. To put that in context, we were anticipating about $675,000 in fare revenue to be collected from January through the end of June based on heavily reduced ridership. The actual reduction in that of that 675,000 could be less than that, just depending on again, how ridership does throughout the spring, the impact of of a vaccine, and a lot of other factors, and exactly when we reinstate it. But I think we can be confident that that would be the maximum impact. And then the impact in terms of the CARES Act dollars, also is driven by how much we spend. And right now, in terms of our actual spending, we're doing very good, and we're going to do our utmost to keep spending as low as possible through the end of this fiscal year. And that also helps. A dollar not spent is also a dollar of CARES Act preserved. So that's really where we're at. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have or specifically related to the financial statements on pages 14 through 16.
Yeah, Evan, thanks for that. Just one question. Have we had to furlough any of the operators or mechanics during this time?
No, we have not.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Evan, Larry Chambers here. Just wondering about the AT2X express service and what we're looking at in terms of the reduced fares there. I mean, I don't know the specifics of that contract or how it works, if it's by per rider or if it's if we've had reduced service. I certainly understand, but just trying to figure out just what kind of a loss that actually means.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the revenue that we earn on that contract is based not on ridership, but by the amount of service that we provide. So that's actually the biggest source of revenue coming in right now. For example, in October, we earned just shy of $37,000. Normally, it would be $69,000 a month. And it's just proportional based on the amount of service that we have out there compared to what we would be running if we were in full service.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no other questions, thank you for your time.
Thanks. We'll move on to the planning reports, item 6.
All right, Mr. Chairman, just a moment while I give Martin control of the presentation here and we confirm that it's working for him.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Josh, it looks like I've got control, so I will get started. So I've got a few planning items on tonight's docket. The first couple are information items relating to the ATV and a couple other items that have been discussed at last month's board meeting. The last item is related to the I-395 commuter choice program and some of the applications that we're submitting, and we are requesting board action on that item to consider for adoption 2 resolutions in support of our applications. So I did slightly flip-flop items 6A and 6B. So we're going to start with the ATV review because it informs some of the other items. So with that, I will jump into the ATV review. And there's a bit of a lag on the slides being changed. So give me one moment, please. There we go. So this is an update on the Alexandria Transit Vision Plan, the ATV. We had discussed last month that it might be beneficial to kind of review and refresh on the ATV, what we're doing with the ATV, what we've done so far, why we're doing this, what actions the board has taken in this project over the last year or two, and then also how it might change, if at all, in light of the COVID situation that we find ourselves in. So those are kind of the highlights of what I'm attempting to cover tonight. I'm going to provide some of the background information that I'm sure many of the board members have heard before. I'll kind of give an abbreviated version, though I do want to offer to any board members, but particularly the newer ones that weren't around in 2018 and 2019, that I'm happy to arrange to do a one-on-one briefing if you have any specific questions or to provide more background on this project, since it's so important to what we're doing here going forward. So that being said, what is the ATV? The ATV is a joint project by DASH and the City of Alexandria to completely reimagine the city's bus network in respect to the year 2030. That's our target year is to develop. Our target is to develop what the bus network should look like in Alexandria by the year 2030. We also have a 2022 scenario, which is more directly relevant right now because we're planning to launch that next summer. But the 2022 scenario is meant to be a first step towards the larger 2030 vision. It allows us to kind of put our stakes in the ground a little bit and to implement the network structure that would kind of be built upon over the next 10 years. So this is a project that was led by a consulting group, Kimley Horn and Jarrett Walker and Associates, who specialize in this type of network visioning study. The study looks at, it starts with a blank slate with no preconceived notions. And it really tries to focus on a couple things. One, data to really understand what the current and future needs are for the city in terms of mobility. And then secondly, an unprecedented amount of public outreach and engagement to understand what the priorities and values of the community, stakeholders, key leadership among Dash and the city, really understand what their values and priorities are. Because at the core of this project is really some fundamental policy questions about how we want to design our transit network as a city. And that was really what the focus of the first year of the ATV was, these kind of policy questions that we tried to respond to. So as we kind of went through the project, the motto kind of emerged that we wanted to make the city's transit network more relevant for more people. We felt like, the network, obviously ridership was going down. We felt like there were large portions of the community that, the transit was not a relevant option for them. And so we wanted to create a more useful system that would encourage more people to use transit for more types of trips, not just during peaks, but all around the clock, all times of day and weekends as well. And just the background on why we wanted to do this back in 2018 when we started this up, bus ridership, as I mentioned, was declining. We felt that bus service was losing relevance as other modes became available. We felt that, obviously Alexandria is changing quite a bit and continues to change. We're expecting that jobs and population in Alexandria will grow by 15 to 20% in the next 10 years, so by 2030. And we know that that growth will happen in areas where there's density now, but it'll happen in areas where there's not density in the future. Some of those areas are served by transit, some are not well served by transit. So areas like Potomac Yard, Eisenhower East, Landmark Mall, et cetera, we want to make sure that we're planning ahead so that we'll have good service in those areas as well. And then also, obviously, we have a new Metro Rail station that's a couple of years away as well. And just the final point is that, in the 35 years Dash has been around, we haven't really taken a holistic approach to assessing our network and having this kind of policy level philosophical discussion about how we want to design our bus network. So we felt that this was a good opportunity to do that. And this is not a new concept to do these network redesigns. These are very popular, especially over the last 5 years or so. The firm that we use, Jarrett Walker, has done many of these around the country and across the world. And these are some of the more relevant ones. Houston was kind of the poster child, and they've had a lot of success with their network redesign over the last 5 years. More recently, Richmond did a redesign that they implemented in 2018, and we've been actually had a couple meetings with GRTC staff to learn about their experience and their lessons as they went through the implementation. So that was really helpful. So as I mentioned, the ATV at its heart is really a policy decision. In the first year or so of our outreach and our discussions with the board was about kind of some of these key policy decisions. We framed them in the form of a series of questions about how a network should be designed. And the board members might remember we had some that were about, are you willing to transfer if your overall travel time is better, or would you prefer to have a one-seat ride? Would you rather have to walk a little bit further if there's more frequent service, or would you prefer less frequent service, but you have to walk less? Those are some of the questions, but the biggest policy question was this idea of ridership versus coverage, which is shown here on this graphic. There's a fictitious city that just kind of demonstrates the principle. But the idea is that when you're designing a transit network, you have a finite number of service hours that you can kind of distribute across routes and across parts of your service area. And you want to be clear, you want to be intentional on what your goals are, and how you distribute the hours should align with what those goals are. So looking at this spectrum, you've got kind of two opposite ends. You have the ridership end of the spectrum, which is basically showing that you have 100% of your hours devoted to maximizing ridership on your routes. And you can see that a lot of the routes are along one main corridor, which has lots of jobs, lots of activity. Sorry, the dots represent people and jobs. So you can see those are denser. So you would expect that if you have really high frequent service along those denser corridors, that you're going to maximize your ridership potential. but you do have larger areas that don't have service, the lower density areas. So that's one kind of extreme end of the spectrum. The other end is the coverage, which you can see is where we're spreading ourselves out a little bit more. So we have geographic coverage. There are more routes, so it's kind of a little bit more complicated. The routes may run a lot less frequently. They probably only run once an hour. Maybe they don't run on weekends, but you do have this kind of social service idea that transit is available to all those who need it, especially those that don't have other options, which is extremely important. So the cost there is that you don't really have a useful service, but the benefit is that you have access for more people. The cost of the ridership on the other end is that you may have some areas that aren't served or aren't well served, but the benefit is that you are maximizing ridership. And that's important because as many of us probably know intuitively, many of the most important benefits of transit are not inherently, we don't confer those benefits simply by the buses running. They have to be full. You're talking about, congestion mitigation, reducing emissions, reducing VMTs, economic, revitalization, all of those things. You don't get those things unless the buses have people on them and have lots of people on them. So the idea behind ridership is that you're maximizing those types of benefits. So long explanation, but Dash is currently, their current system was assessed at about 50-50. So about 50% of our hours are working toward this ridership goal, about 50% towards our coverage goal. So we presented the board and the public with a number of different concepts and options at different points on the spectrum. And the result was that in spring of 2019, the board recommended that we should design our future networks with a goal towards 85% ridership and 15% coverage. So a pretty dramatic shift towards the ridership goals. So that was one of the recommendations. There was also a caveat on that recommendation that the coverage, the service that is dedicated towards coverage should really focus on areas that have higher percentages of seniors and persons with disabilities. There were also recommendations about peak services and that productive peak services should be maintained. And that was particularly in reference to the AT3 and the AT4, which are peak only routes that run from Park Fairfax and Northridge up to the Pentagon. There was a strong, there's a lot of feedback on those. And then we did have a lot of discussions in the last fall about the AT2 along Seminary Road and Janney's Lane. That originally was not included in the final ATV proposals, but based on feedback from the public and the board, we ended up including that with the caveat that we would be monitoring ridership to ensure that that ridership along that segment was continuing to increase. And then just throughout the whole process, there was a lot of emphasis from the board on serving low-income and minority riders. And the last slide I'll talk about before I pause for any questions is just kind of putting this through the lens of COVID. I think the ATV was prescient in a lot of ways in that the main things that it does and the things that it's trying to achieve are still really well suited to a post-COVID transit situation that we find ourselves in. As we know, during COVID, the peak ridership has dropped dramatically. And all-day ridership has dropped less so. So we have like a lot of our peak-only routes have dropped by 90%, but some of our all-day routes are only down by about 50% or so. And that's not that surprising, but it is well aligned with what the ATV does, which is shift the focus away from peak-oriented services and more towards your all-day services and weekend services. So you're having better service during middays, evenings, and weekends, and those are helpful for people who don't have the typical 9-to-5 jobs. And are more kind of maybe service industry workers, healthcare workers. So obviously that's really good now. The second part is the focus on low income and minority residents. These ATV scenarios are shown to have a major improvement to the access to transit, to useful transit for low income areas and communities of color. We're increasing the number of low income and minority residents with access to frequent all-day transit by 2 to 3 times in 2022, and even more so in the 2030 network. Obviously, those groups have been hit much harder by the COVID pandemic and resulting recession. So certainly a good point to note there. Like I said, weekend service is greatly improved in these scenarios. If we're able to implement the full 2022 ATV network, that would be doubling the amount of service hours on Sundays and a 50% increase for service on Saturdays. And like I said, weekend ridership is not down nearly as much as weekday ridership is. And we've done a good job, even though we've moved away from coverage in terms of the policy. We've done a pretty good job, I think, of maintaining some level of service for 99% of existing boardings. So 99% of people who board the bus, well, I guess not today, but before COVID, 99% of them would still have a bus stop within an eighth of a mile. So pretty good there. And then lastly, the point was kind of raised earlier, but we've got these dramatic reductions proposed for WMATA for FY22. I think Josh made this point, but I think we are, with the ATV, we're in a better position to mitigate the impacts if those cuts come to fruition than we would be under the current network. There's some improvements, particularly in the West End, that will provide better connections that would help us with those cuts. And I think there was a question from Matt about if we were able to kind of take up some of the slack on some of those. And I think, like I said, the ATV puts us in a better position. And I think I'll note that since we've been coordinating so closely with WMATA, they have designed these reductions in a way that is, if there's any silver line, they've designed them in a way that's compatible with what we're trying to do with the ATV. So if they did have to go through with these cuts, it would not have a major impact on our ATV plans. However, we would be probably communicating with them in January and February to make some potential tweaks to the network. And I think in terms of expanding our service to take over some of the routes, without any additional resources, that would be challenging because we'd have to take service away from within the city of Alexandria. And I think our main focus, especially with the ATV, is focusing on all-day service within Alexandria. But certainly we will continue to talk with WMATA in January and February as they do their public outreach, and we kind of have a better idea of how realistic their cuts might be. So I'll pause there. I've been talking for a while. Happy to address any comments or questions.
Hey, Martin, this is Matt. Thanks for reminding me of what I found deficient in the ATV. But otherwise, you may know I'm chair of the Human Rights Commission, and the city's undertaken an equity initiative project. That's a long-term project. I'm just curious, a couple things. If you've met with Jacqueline Tucker, who's the new equity officer, she's out of the Office of Human Rights, and also how you came up with the 2 to 3 times increase for low-income, minority, and senior residents, other than making folks have to walk farther to get to the bus stop.
So I haven't met with Ms. Tucker. Happy to connect with her if you could provide information. And then the other question you had about the access, that's I just kind of rephrased. We've been sharing some graphs, the kind of horizontal bar graphs that show the changes in access. And I should have included a slide here, but I just wanted to summarize. But those basically measure the people today who have access within a quarter mile of frequent all-day transit. That's transit that runs every 15 minutes or better, 7 days a week, all day. And comparing those folks who have access to that today versus the future network. So we could look at that as all residents, then we look at that in terms of minority residents, and then in terms of low-income residents and seniors. And
like what's low income? Is it the area standard, and then you use census data from 2010? You know what I mean? What's the criteria for that?
Yeah, so we do use census data. I think the poverty threshold is a little different here in this type of area because it's a little more affluent of an area. I think it's twice the poverty threshold. It's twice the national poverty threshold. It's based on census data. It's kind of I think that's kind of the widely used definition for planners in terms of what constitutes low income for Title VI purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Matt, I would just add that as part of the Human Services Recovery Plan, Jacqueline Tucker's been involved in that, and the one key transportation initiative was advancing the ATV for these exact reasons. And so she is aware of the plan and the coordination and working toward that.
And who is Jacqueline Tucker?
She is the city's equity and diversity officer. Is that her correct title?
Yeah, she started in February.
Ms. Thomas, did I see a hand? No?
No.
Okay. Okay. And any other questions? I have one more slide on the ATV. And this one is, well, I think it's a little, it's kind of exciting, and looks like Josh agrees with his font choices. What you're looking at here is a first glimpse of the new the network. You know, we're behind the scenes doing a lot of work with our operations team, with our marketing team, with our safety team to begin the process for the implementation of this network, since it's such a major undertaking to flip the switch and change all your routes overnight. So one of the first things we've had to do with our marketing team is to kind of determine what we're gonna call this, and some of the route numbers as well. So I'm gonna have trouble with this adjustment, but from now on, we're calling it the new Dash network instead of the ATV. The reason for that is that we are recognizing that anytime someone hears vision and plan, a lot of people will probably tune out as something that's kind of far off in the future and not something that's directly relevant for them. So we're trying to pick a name that's more straightforward and direct, that your routes very, very well could be changing. And so this is something that's very important and very immediate. So that's why we've changed to the new Dash network. Not the most creative, but it's very simple and straightforward. And then you can also see, and I should mention, there's a larger version of this map on, I think it's page 20 of your packet. Let me double check that. Yeah, page 21 of your packet. So I know it's hard to see on this screen, but this basically gives you a sense of what the Dash network will look like. A lot of the other ATV maps have shown WMATA routes as well. This one shows WMATA routes in gray, but the Dash routes are shown in color, so you can kind of see what Dash would be operating. You can see that we are changing the names. We're no longer having the AT prefix or the N prefix, just for simplicity and for ease, especially for non-English speakers. We're calling them lines, not routes, and the reason for that is to convey directness. Routes sometimes kind of convey circuitousness. Lines are more direct. And then we have, after a lot of consideration in a couple different scenarios, we are identifying our core network as the 30 series, lines 30 through 36, and then our weekday only services or peak only services as 102 through 104. The thoughts that go into this numbering is that we're trying to make sure that we are aligned with other providers so that we're not having, a Dash line 22 and then a WMATA line 22. We want to avoid confusion. We're also using these numbers to convey information to riders about the routes, which is something that we haven't done in the past. What we're conveying is that the line 30 series are routes that run 7 days per week. So that's kind of the core network. And then these 100 routes are only running on weekdays or peaks. And then there's also some other kind of considerations about where the routes go. And if there's a shared corridor, kind of having two sequential routes so that a rider knows that they can catch either the 30 or the 31 or the 32. And it's easier to remember that way. So those are kind of a first glimpse. There'll be plenty more to come on this, but I just wanted to share that with you all at this point.
When are you going to start to communicate these changes to the public in terms of what, because it's going to be big for people to have to get used to new numbers and understanding what service they need.
Yeah. So we'll be using these new route numbers, new line numbers, when we do the proposed TDP, which is our annual service change document. We'll be doing that in March. So that's probably the first time the public will see these new route numbers. But then as we get closer to June 27, a couple of weeks, especially a couple of weeks in advance, we'll have a lot of boots on the ground, a lot more. Obviously, we'll have a lot of outreach during the TDP process in March and April. But as we get closer to the actual implementation, we'll be doing a whole marketing plan, an outreach plan, and Whitney Code will be leading that to make sure people understand the specific impact that these changes will have for them, because it's one thing to look at a map, but it's a lot harder to understand what the specific impact will be for each individual rider. So we've got a lot of things that we're working on to work on conveying that information.
Great. Anybody else? Larry?
Yeah, Larry here. I think the numbers make really good sense. I'm glad we're making that change now before anybody had a chance to get used to the in routes. I think people will be making the leap straight from AT to numbers, which shouldn't be too difficult.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Well, so you're going to do the planning decision-making criteria?
Yes.
Next.
So this is, the next item is a kind of a summary of our service planning decision-making framework. There is a memo which is shown on—
Martin, I'm sorry, if I could just interrupt.
Yeah.
Martin, I'm sorry, I just wanted to interrupt you for a second. I just wanted to explain why we have this on the agenda. I'm sorry if you don't mind, before you jump into the presentation. This really was kind of an outgrowth of the discussion we had last month, where for a lot of us who were new, who were trying to understand what criteria staff was using when they were sending up the proposed reductions, which was just in response to an exercise, but then may become reality. And as we are all aware of the dire situation the city faces, we wanted to make sure that there was agreement among the board about the criteria and basically what factors are going in, kind of get away from discussing the individual routes and the attachments that we have to it, but just to understand the criteria and kind of the metrics, and is also to help us in conversations with the public as well about these. So that's really the reason for this presentation and why it's coming up now. So thank you for—
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so you'll find on page 17 of your packets, there's a brief memo or document that summarizes in more detail this framework that I'm going over this evening. But basically, as Mr. Chairman said, we're trying to put this in front of you to get some feedback this month, and then we'll be back next month with kind of a final version for your review and consideration and approval. But basically, the process for how we make our service decisions is driven largely from the guidance that we got during the ATV process. Since we're moving more towards a ridership-oriented goals, we have identified ridership as the #1 factor in our decision. And one thing I should note is that when we are actually making proposals to the board for any route changes or service changes, we will be providing specific information that kind of follows this formula. So providing kind of having a line item that shows this is what we're proposing for this route, and this is how it measures up in terms of some of these different metrics. So ridership was our top factor, our most important factor. These are ranked in order of how important they are to our decision. We're talking about ridership in terms of the impact. So if you're improving service, the number of riders that it's adding. If you're reducing service, the number of riders that perhaps it's taking away. And we want to be clear that it's not just, especially for reductions, it's not just the number of riders that are affected, it's also the extent of that impact. So, you could be reducing headways on a route that has 1,000 people. And of course, that's, really bad. But, if you're eliminating service entirely for a segment that has 100 people, we want to be clear on the distinction between those different things. And so we can kind of talk about that and weigh those against each other. So there's some nuance to the ridership, but the bottom line is that ridership is kind of the most important factor in our decisions. And we often look at that in terms of boardings, daily boardings, boardings per revenue hour, et cetera. The second one here is equity, and this has kind of always been important, but certainly more so recently. And we want to just make sure that we are understanding how any proposed change affects low-income and minority communities. DASH is not required to do full Title VI analyses that are normally required by FDA recipients, but we do make sure that we are assessing the impact. We have some service planning tools, web-based service planning tools that allow us to do this, so we can kind of see, based on census data, what the impacts of different route changes are. Alternatives, we want to make sure we understand if we're reducing or eliminating service, what other options are available. If there's a corridor that has 2 different routes and we're proposing to reduce one of the routes, but most riders can still use the other route, that's certainly a consideration that we want to take account. Cost efficiency, that's pretty straightforward, just the net cost per rider. So if we're adding service, the total net cost of that increase divided by the expected riders. If we're reducing service, how much money we're saving divided by the number of riders that will be lost. So we try to include that as well. And then let's see, coverage. We've mentioned in the ATV that that's still a strong consideration. So we want to make sure that we're, providing coverage in areas where it makes sense to do so, specifically in those areas with higher percentages of senior and persons with disabilities. And then the last 2 are just customer feedback. We're always trying to incorporate feedback from our customers and even from our operators and other staff as well into our decisions. And then the last one is staff judgment. Sometimes we need to use our professional discretion, professional judgment when it comes to determining what makes the most sense. So that's just a brief summary. Happy to take any questions and feedback, and then we'll be back next month.
Any questions for Martin? Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
go ahead, Larry.
Mr. Chairman, no questions from me. I think just a statement. Looking at this decision-making matrix. Thank you, Martin. It's very clear, and I concur with the decision-making process here. I would just point out that I think that my concerns of our last meeting really revolved around that number 6 and number 7, with bringing in what is now the 102 onto the chopping block at a fairly late date, going up to the manager. So just want to put that on the record, since if this was brought to address those concerns remain.
Okay, thank you.
Why don't we move on to the commuter choice program?
Did Jim have a question? Jim, I saw you.
No, I think this is a great presentation, Martin. I really appreciate all this context. I recognize we have a number of newer board members, and so this context is essential reading for everybody. I would just note to the chair, we are 5 minutes from the time that this meeting is supposed to adjourn, and we still have a lot of content left. And our last meeting went very long as well, and was a great conversation. But I think given where we are with COVID, and many of us are trying to balance family commitments and work commitments, and are on Zooms from 9 a.m. until whenever, but we try to run these meetings maybe a bit more efficiently, and when things can be read offline. That's why we have the packet. I also think staff is very open to having briefings outside of these public board meeting sessions. And I certainly have gotten feedback from them offline. I think we might be able to move forward a bit more efficiently if you take slightly different tactics to how to run some of these meetings.
I appreciate the feedback, Jim. I know we do try to use our time wisely, and I do hope that by having this discussion, we all can learn from one another, and also for our newer board members, I think it will make our process this spring run a little more smoothly. But I know I talk with the general manager each month before we finalize the agenda, and that's certainly something I will keep in mind in the discussions with him about how we can make sure that we're using the meetings to their full extent. I certainly don't want to return to the days when we were there till 10:30, 11 o'clock, which happens sometimes to contentious items. But I appreciate that, and we will try to be respectful of everybody's time as we go forward.
Thank you, Sharon.
So with that, let's move on to the commuter choice.
I will just very briefly, this is a graphic that we prepared. We talked very briefly last meeting about the timeline going forward for FY22 for the budget and TVP process. I just wanted to highlight this. You can see kind of the parallel paths for how we're moving forward over the next 6 months. You can see the orange icon right here shows where we're at in December. And last month we had the approval of the draft 22 budget. I think the point of this graphic is to show that we have some additional opportunities when we get the feedback from the city on what our proposed budget will be in February, and then in March, staff will be presenting our draft TDP and budget, and that will be followed by 2 months of outreach. And then in May, the board will receive the TDP and budget for final adoption. So just wanted to share that. Please, at your leisure, take a look at it more closely, but just wanted to share that.
And we're going to bring this slide back, I think, every month, just as a visual reminder of where we are.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Okay, and the last item here is the I-395 Community Choice Grant application. There is board action requested for this item. This is the program that allocates 395 express lane toll revenues. It's been around for a couple of years now. This is the second cycle. They have about $15 million per year that are allocated to transit projects that improve person throughput in 395-95 corridor. It's jointly administered by NBTC and PRTC. And the picture you saw there is a picture of one of our projects that we have funding for right now, the AT1 Plus, with the specially wrapped buses. So we currently have 2 projects that are receiving 395-95 funding. We awarded those projects back in 2019. We began the service enhancements on those 2 routes in October of 2019, and they've been incredibly successful. During a time period when, and this was the first 5 months, obviously before COVID hit, but during those first 5 months of operation on these 2 routes, we saw huge increases in ridership. When the rest of the system was only was down by a couple percentage points, the AT1 Plus grew by 25% year over year, and the AT9 was 45% higher in terms of monthly boardings during that 5-month period as compared to the preceding year. So huge increases. You can see the average daily increases as well on the right side there. So really positive things, really positive trends made possible by this 395 program. And the total funding that we received through the program in the current cycle is $5 million over 20 months, which works out to about $3 million a year. So now we're in the second round. We're applying for the second round of funding. We are planning to pursue similar projects. They're on the same corridors as the 2 projects we have right now, but they are in line with the 2022 ATV new Dash Network plan. They are, the one shown here is the West End to Pentagon enhancements, which are now called Line 35. You can see on the map, Line 35 is the blue line that goes from Van Dorn Metro all the way up to the Pentagon. It actually follows the exact same, almost the exact same alignment as the existing AT1 Plus route from Van Dorn Metro to Mark Center, but it continues on to the Pentagon. It also has much better service headways. It's planned to run every 10 minutes all day on weekdays and every 15 minutes on weekends. So you're establishing this as an all-day frequent route, which is really the threshold that makes transit much more useful to the average rider. And this is a net cost of about $6.88 million over a 2-year period, which in itself would be more, actually a little bit more than what we're receiving right now for the 2 current projects that we have. So even if we just got this, it would be a net gain. And this is our top priority project. Second one is a similar situation. This is Line 36, which is a crosstown route. You can see that it's replacing the AT9. AT9 is showing orange, goes from Potomac Yard over to Mark Center via Shirlington. So very similar alignment, but we're adding a lot more service to it in line with what we recommended through the ATV plan. The headways would go up to every 15 minutes all day, 7 days a week. So you'd have it, this as well would be a frequent all day route. So very positive there. Total cost would be about $4 million over a 2-year period. So combine the 2 projects, we're asking for about $11 million over a 2-year period, which is a significant increase over what we asked last time. But given the budget situation, we're trying to do whatever we can to get additional funds to make these improvements happen. So we've been having a lot of discussion with NBTC staff, also been talking to city staff, and we're comfortable moving forward with these, and we're optimistic about our chances, certainly for the first project and hopefully for the second one as well. So we have 2 resolutions in support of these projects, and they're listed here. happy to take any questions.
Jim?
Mark, I guess two questions just to clarify. One is both of these are for primarily for operating expenses, correct? For both of the projects, both the routes?
Correct.
I mean, these seem great, and that I see no reason why we shouldn't all support this and pursue the funding. Although I will just ask, what's the plan when the funding is goes away in 2 years, since these are operating costs? So what's how are you all thinking about this in the longer term from a funding perspective?
So we would be planning to reapply every 2 years. There's that's permitted to the program. That's similar to what we're doing here, since we kind of had these projects currently. And so, if absent the ATV, if we just had the AT1, the AT9 continuing, we would be planning to reapply every 2 years. That's what we would intend to do here. And it's helpful because we have a lot of changes in the West End corridor for the potential West End Transitway. So it's possible that we could have some additional route changes in the future that we could also apply for this funding.
Yeah, Jim, I would just,
Thanks.
that's a really good question, Jim. And I think, I would share that concern. I would just say, as Martin pointed out, that the uniqueness about this funding method is that you can reapply for the same service, right? So theoretically, we could get in a little bit of a bind if that money dried up, or somehow it, lost priority. But seemingly, assuming things continue to be, good with the toll revenue and whatnot, it should be okay. One hope.
And there are some limitations on local routes in terms of how many years you can apply for these, but both of these would be considered as regional routes. So we would not have those same limitations.
I had just
Thank you.
one question. I had just one question, Martin, on the route that's replacing the AT1. It looks like part of that is also duplicating what the 7 does. And I know when Hillary had presented what WMATA was planning to do in terms of the Metro bus service, that they were going to be maintaining service on the 7, which I know goes beyond just the area that we cover. But will there be changes made as a result if we get this grant because of the amount of service that will be going down that corridor? Will there be changes to the Metro bus routing?
Yes, thank you for asking. It's a really good question and a point that I failed to make. So the Beauregard corridor here from basically Southern Towers down to Lincolnia is currently operated by the 7A and 7F, as you mentioned. Their plan as part of the ATV is that they would reroute that down from Southern Towers. It would go to the other side of 395, to the Van Dorn Street corridor. And it would go down to Landmark Mall and then onto Van Dorn Metro on that side of 395 instead of on the Beauregard side, because this new route would take over that segment. So there's a coordination there with WMATA, and that's also represented in their recently released service reductions. They show the 7A as having that new alignment.
Okay. Anybody else? If not, I'll call for a motion. We can vote on these as a block unless anyone requests that we separate them.
I'd move to approve the 2 resolutions. This is
Moved by Linda.
Yeah.
Is there a second? I didn't hear who was first.
Second.
Was that Ian? Okay, we'll give it to Ian. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Any abstentions? All right, passes unanimously. Thank you. Last order of business I have is just to announce that our next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, January 13th, and on Zoom. And to wish all of you, however you celebrate, very happy holidays and a wonderful new year. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Ian. Who was the second?
I'll second it.
Second.
All right, Steve, all in favor?
Aye.
Hi. Happy holidays, everybody.
Any opposed?
Enjoy your holiday.
Hey, everybody.
Stay safe.
Nice,
Stay
everybody.
safe.
Holidays.
Take care.